Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan. On this episode, I sat down with Tristan Brown, Professor of Energy Resources and Economics at State University of New York and Vice President at Molecule Group. Molecule Group focuses on research across the bioeconomy space, and Tristan is leading some research on land use change as well as sustainable chemical uses. Tristan and I do a deep dive into how policy impacts market design, capital allocation, and how it does or doesn't provide market incentives for participants. And Tristan gives lots of great examples where policy does and does not provide the right frameworks in the bioeconomy arena. I was thrilled to be able to do this deep dive with Tristan ahead of the Transportation Energy Institute's 2026 annual conference, where Tristan will be joining me as a panelist on our panel titled Fueling Controversy, Are Biofuels Helping or Hurting? If you're attending the conference next week in Fort Worth, make sure you join us and then come and say hi. For all upcoming episodes, make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Tristan. Hey, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Navigating Carbon podcast. Today, I'm joined by Tristan Brown. Tristan, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about you, Deb?
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
We're going to have a fun conversation today about the bioeconomy. A lot of the conversations I have tend to be quite fossil fuel focused, but I'm excited to switch to the biofuel piece. You're a professor of energy, resource, and economics at the State University of New York. So very cool to pull apart those aspects of energy and resources in the bioeconomy space. But you're also VP of a group called the Molecule Group. Tell us a little bit about what Molecule Group does and how the work both that you're doing there and impacts, and you talk to industry and stuff like that.
So Molecule Group's a relatively new organization, only been around for, I think it's about 1.5 to 2 years now. And it was really developed to fill a gap in what we see in the international policy arena around consensus building. Obviously, there's a lot of lobbying firms out there, especially at the international level. We're not lobbying, we're not lobbyists, but rather what we focus on is getting the international community and especially stakeholders surrounding a particular topic that's really critical to the international community, pulling them together and identifying where the areas of consensus that exist are, and ideally developing a consensus-based framework about how to move forward with a particular issue. And so just to give you examples, there's two that I'm heading up at Molecule Group. One is on induced land use change, so indirect land use change and direct land use change. Obviously a really critical, important, I would say, topic in the biofuel space in particular, going back to about 2008. And, it's, even though we've been dealing with it for close to 20 years, still a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions, a lot of different opinions. And then also working around what we call the sustainable chemicals and materials space, which is not something I don't think people thought a whole lot about last year. And now, especially in the last month or so, they've started to think about it a whole lot more. And this is the idea that, when we talk about moving off of petroleum, only about 2/3 of every barrel of petroleum that we use is used as a fuel, right? When we think gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, the rest go to everything from commodity chemicals to asphalt, right? Building materials, things like that, where they're not going to be burned. They're not going to be used as a fuel. And so if we're ultimately, as the world, back and forth, right? It's kind of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back thing. But as the world moves towards displacing fossil fuels, we have to start looking at, well, how do we also find sustainable alternatives for these non-fuel products? And so really those are the 2 aspects that I head up at Molecule Group.
I love it. And I think we may get into a little bit of this as we go through the discussion, but the idea of substitution of fossil fuels isn't exactly to your point. It's not as simple as what a lot of people just, they put fuel in their car and have gas in their homes, and it's not quite as simple as those things, which are
Buy an
hugely
electric vehicle and
important.
you're all done, right?
Yep, exactly, right? I think it's fascinating work. So hopefully we'll get into a little bit of that as we go through. So given your focus on 3 of the things that I love, to be honest, energy, policy, and economics, we're sort of going to dive through and kind of talk about, particularly in the agriculture, bioeconomy, biofuel space,
Mhm.
how, we start with market design and what we see in terms of what is driving, again, substitution and, that sort of change to low carbon solutions and stuff. So I'm curious, as you're sort of looking at this, both domestically and internationally, particularly with some of the work you're doing with Molecule Group, how much does policy impact market design in your mind?
It depends. It really depends on how well the policy is drafted. You can have policy that really drives that market design very, very effectively. And so, I give the classic example in the United States of our corn ethanol industry. This was something that was stood up in just a matter of years, and very similar conditions to what we see now. Right? We look at the period from about 2005 to 2008. We thought the world was running out of petroleum. The whole Hubbard's peak debate that we'd seen in the U.S. was being applied worldwide. And if you looked at, population growth combined with what we expected was going to happen with global petroleum reserves, we thought we were going to be facing, very, very drastic shortages in the 2020s. So petroleum prices skyrocket. Countries like the U.S. start looking at, well, how can we find other sources? And so the U.S., especially in the years after 9/11, but particularly in about 2005, 6, and 7, really started emphasizing market design and policies that would help drive a market for alternative fuels.
Mm.
And in just a matter of years, we saw major, major investment occur to the point where we went from, ethanol displacing maybe 1 to 2% of gasoline to about 10% of
Yeah.
gasoline. So that type of thing, very, very effective. On the other hand, right, when we look at the electric vehicle sector, we can see different countries, different policy designs, very different outcomes. Here in the US, I think we've seen electric vehicle sales fall by close to 50% over the last year, year and a half, which tells us, right, market design that had been set up, maybe not as persistent as we had expected it to be. You go to other countries, right? China is now pushing 50% electric vehicle sales, 1.3, 1.4 billion people.
Yeah.
So they found ways to really drive that forward. And so I think, just because you have a policy doesn't mean that you're going to have the market design you intended. But if you have a policy that's been designed well, you can then get that market design that you want.
Yeah, I love that. And I think more and more, and I've said this a number of times, is that like I think we see more and more that like energy policy is also climate policy and climate
Hmm.
policy is also energy policy. And it's
Yes.
your point around the electric vehicles has been really a really interesting one as we've seen the policy in the US sort of shift back to fossil fuels and that rhetoric and stuff. So it's a really interesting example in that space. So like as we think about then, how policy and market design is put in place, like how much of it emissions is really challenging because it's always
Hmm.
calculated. We're getting better at trying to measure point sources and things like that, but particularly in like the agriculture biospace, that's still I still believe it's quite challenging. So tell me if I'm wrong on that. But like how much, given that we do need to model emissions and stuff versus trying to understand like what's actually happening and stuff like that, like how does policy and market design kind of get impacted by some of that and that tension between modeled versus actual and some of that kind of stuff? So
It has a huge impact. When we think about different energy resources, especially different low carbon energy resources, they can be from relatively simple, and so when we think it's something like solar PV, wind power, fairly straightforward if you want to model the carbon intensity or the greenhouse gas emission reductions from that, right? As long as you know what your baseline is. To you get into, especially when you start thinking about, say, sustainable aviation fuel pathways, they can be highly complex. There can be a lot of different inputs. You're going to need hydrogen, you're going to need carbon, you're going to need, in some cases, power. What's the carbon intensity of every single one of those inputs? And how does that affect the carbon intensity of that finished product? And so it can be very, very complex. And so this is a challenge from a policy standpoint because you can't use a one size fits all
mm,
methodology, right? But at the same time, you need something that's uniform. And especially when we start looking at, say, a state program going from one state to the other, if you're not uniform across those states, that's going to really cause a lot of market fragmentation
yep.
issues. And so I think this is where, we take the example of the West Coast with the low carbon fuel standard got started in California. And now you have, well, I guess New Mexico just joined on, officially
Oh, I didn't
yesterday it
realize
got
that. There
started.
you go.
Yeah. April 1st, I believe they kicked it off. They had a whole process last year to finalize it. So you now have 4 states west of the Rockies that are all have their own low carbon fuel standard systems, but they're all based on comparable metrics. They're all using the same, not even just life cycle assessment methodologies, but using the same underlying model. Because if you don't do that, then you have fragmentation. And
Mm,
so there's really a fine line between making sure that you are specific, that you're calculating the greenhouse gases of a particular fuel being used in a particular location, but that you have an underlying methodology that's uniform across the different areas doing this.
Yeah. And I love that, and the underlying model, if I'm correct, is the Greek model that's used in
Correct. Yep.
that particular system, which broadly seems to be getting adoption, particularly for biofuels
Hmm.
and that kind of stuff. Which is, I think, this is one of the things I hear a lot is that need for standardization. I think it's such an important point that you bring up around like what does that look like, and so like as policy then adopts these models, like do you think it's really, particularly, they sort of choose a winner and say, that's the model we're going to adopt. Everyone picks it, everyone uses it. Like, you sort of talked a little bit about the importance, but like, do you think we'll start to see that then more broadly? Like, as Canada's doing, a low carbon fuel standard and others, like how important is it then that that just becomes like the global standard potentially, or like, like, how do we sort of think about this standardization piece and the importance of that?
Yeah, it's a great question because, here in the US, we largely see the GREET model used, the federal government. So, GREET model, for any viewers aren't familiar with it, this was developed by Argonne National Lab, and I never remember the exact acronym, but it's essentially it's modeling
Yes.
greenhouse gases across a pathway or technology. And so, we look at everything from fuels to electricity, could be fossil, could be renewable. It's a single model that does a really great job of telling you what the carbon intensity of that finished product, that finished fuel or energy source is going to be. And so it's been adopted. Every state that has a low carbon fuel standard uses the GREET model, the federal government. But the GREET model is in turn based on what we would consider true standardization, which is there are ISO standards about how you conduct life cycle assessment and how you calculate the carbon intensities of specific fuels. And the ISO standards are truly global. And so you
Mhm.
mentioned Canada, for example. Canada doesn't use the GREET model because the GREET model is a US thing, but they do use a model that was developed based on the ISO standard in question. I believe it's 14044. So then you have standardization between different countries, and, at the end of the day, you kind of keep going down, but the ISO standard at the end of the day is what most countries are using. And so even though you'll have different models in different jurisdictions, different countries, they're trying to all utilize the same underlying modeling principles to make them comparable with one another.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen it's so important because particularly for fuels and stuff, liquid fuels, it's a global market. We're seeing some
Exactly.
of the
Yep.
challenges right now is those global markets are being very strained. So that's cool that they're again that some of these things, and it's I think more and more we're hearing about like where some of the standardization is happening to try and unify, different kind of whether
Hmm.
fuels and life cycle assessments and stuff like that. So thinking about then like switching onto the like economic side as we, away from the market design piece, like data inputs has a really big impact on, output and what carbon intensity is assessed for different life cycles and stuff like that. Have you seen like as you're sort of thinking about the economic side and looking at that, like have you seen that like potentially small fluctuations in carbon intensity can really impact potentially like the price that someone might get and things like that? Like how is some of that carbon intensity like translating into like capital allocation and pricing and where people might put different funding into different projects and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is why standardization is so important because if you don't have standardization, you're ultimately going to have market distortions. And these market distortions, even relatively small input differences, can have a big impact. And I'll just give you the example. So, here in New York, so most of the world, certainly the US states that are handling biofuels, so California, Oregon, Washington, etc., they take the approach that when you combust a fuel, a biofuel in this case, right, you're going to release biogenic CO2. Um,
Mhm.
and that biogenic CO2, though, is different from what we call fossil or geological CO2 because biogenic CO2 was in the atmosphere not so recently. Right. And then a plant, the feedstock you use to produce the biofuel, as it grew, it pulled that CO2 out of the atmosphere. That CO2 is being returned to the atmosphere. Next growing season, it's going to be pulled back out of the atmosphere, right? So it's a very short-lived impact. The reason that fossil fuel CO2 emissions are so detrimental to the climate is you're taking CO2 that was last in the atmosphere a few million years ago. You're putting it in the atmosphere, and it's going to be a few million years more before it's actually pulled out of the atmosphere again. So, on the one hand, we're looking at a single growing season compared to millions of years. And so recognizing that big difference, states like California say, okay, as long as that biogenic feedstock's been produced sustainably, we treat the CO2 emissions as carbon neutral. They are not
Mhm.
going to have a net impact on climate change. New York is a little odd in that, under our climate law, we actually treat biogenic CO2 emissions the exact same as fossil CO2 emissions.
Okay.
So biofuels are effectively fossil fuels, which doesn't really line up with the science, let alone how other states do it, but it is the way it is. Canada, just north of New York, follows the California approach. And
Mm.
so we are actually seeing, right. And so it's a relatively minor difference at the end of the day because, the CO2 emissions are not a huge aspect of that overall life cycle, but it can be important. It
Yeah.
certainly is enough to make a difference. And so we have a situation now where we have renewable natural gas producers here in New York. They are producing renewable natural gas from things like food waste, right? You think about all the expired products that supermarkets throw out rather
Yeah.
than landfill it, they digest it, convert it to renewable natural gas. And then that renewable natural gas is being piped up to Canada and used in Canada's low carbon, or their CFR, their clean fuel system,
Clean fuel
rather than
code.
New York, because you get an additional climate benefit recognized in Canada that you don't in New York. So even though
Yeah.
it's more expensive and more energy intensive to ship it up there rather than using it where it's being produced, it's a distortionary effect resulting from that
Okay.
lack of standardization.
It's such a good example because that was going to be my next question around like how much with all these different policies and stuff like that, like how much of the investment or like where people are then selling their fuels and stuff like that is driven by real market, like real
Hmm.
CO2 reduction versus where can I get a better price and like send stuff and things like that. And so that's a really good
Exactly.
example of like I don't know, in my mind, companies will always look to where they can make the most money for their product. And so it creates these sort of weird market distortions, as you talked about. I remember early on when the low carbon fuel standard in California, the price was really high. There was all this biofuel being shipped up from
Hmm.
Brazil. And it's
Yep.
like, well, that's not a net reduction just because they can get this credit. And so it's how do you think, as you think about, again, policy design and capital allocation and some of that kind of stuff, like, how do we get around some of that? Do you think there's a way to get around some of that? Like, how do we like, it's I don't know, it's a challenging problem. Like,
It is, and this is why it's so important to make sure that your market incentives are aligned with the
mhm,
policy outcomes. And especially when we think policy outcomes from a climate change perspective, climate policy, you want to make sure that they are very, very closely aligned because you can also have the opposite problem, right? On the one hand, you want to make sure that you are recognizing the climate benefits that are occurring because if you don't, then you have an affordability issue, right? You're ultimately not going to get the fuels that you need or the energy systems that you need to decarbonize, which is going to push up your carbon abatement costs. And it's consumers that have to pay that at the end of the day. We're certainly seeing that in New York today.
mm,
But on the flip side, if you over incentivize, then you're also wasting money. And that's ultimately taxpayer dollars. And I'll give you the example. So talked earlier about how rapidly the U.S. corn ethanol system scaled up 2005, 2006. Big part of that was because the federal government had created a tax credit. It was called the VEETC, the Volumetric Excise Ethanol Tax Credit, Ethanol Excise
has to be an
Tax Credit.
acronym. Has to
Yeah,
be an
yeah, it
acronym.
has to be always an alphabet soup, right? And this one, it was unique in that it was just a set dollar amount that an ethanol producer could get from the IRA. Right. So normally
Okay.
we think about having to pay, right? April 15th being around the corner. Normally you pay the IRA. Well, if
Yep.
you produced enough ethanol, the IRA would actually, I'm sorry, not IRA. I keep
IRS.
thinking of IRS. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Then we had the Inflation Reduction Act and all
Oh
the
yeah.
acronyms just got
It's
completely messed up.
again, got to have
IRS.
an
Thank
acronym.
you. Yeah. Would pay you. The problem was that this was being done at a time when petroleum prices were skyrocketing. Ethanol producers were already making far more than they needed to
Oh.
incentivize production, and it was just a windfall profit on top of that.
Mm.
And at one point, 2006, ethanol producers were making a 300% profit margin based on the crush spread that existed at the time, right?
Oh
Normally,
my
you'd say
goodness.
10% profit margin, you're doing really, really well.
Yeah.
There was a 300% profit margin.
Wow.
And so at that point, that's just wasting taxpayer dollars. So you want to make sure that you're crediting the benefits that are being achieved, but you're not over crediting it and generating windfall profits for these
Yeah.
companies.
And it's so like we think about some of these industries in a silo to a certain extent, particularly like for those of us within certain industries, we get so focused on just our, that's what we know, that's our industry and stuff
Hmm.
like that. And but the energy market broadly is so all-encompassing, to your point that, like, it's so impacted, ethanol corn producers could be so impacted by oil prices, maybe isn't something that, again, a policy, person even thought about, and yet it is becoming and even more important, I think, as it becomes more, integrated and stuff like that. It's, I don't know if you've got any thoughts around that, but it seems like, again, we make these decisions in, like, such vacuums to a certain extent without necessarily seeing the bigger picture. So, I don't
Well, and
yeah.
that's the challenge with crafting good policy, and this is, a great example of what happened. So you had those massive windfall profits. Congress in 2011 said, "This isn't good. We don't like this." They got rid of the tax credit, and a few years before that, Congress had replaced or basically put in place something different, a mandate, a blending mandate called the renewable fuel standard. And the renewable fuel standard had an incentive called a renewable identification number that was a market based incentive. So the idea was, right, the price of a RIN would fluctuate. When petroleum prices were really high, biofuel producers didn't need an incentive, RIN values would be low.
Yep.
When they needed that subsidy, though, when they needed that incentive, RIN prices would be high. So the idea was you get around this issue of windfall profits or not providing enough of incentive to get the benefits that you're looking for. Challenge with a market-based commodity like that is the market can be manipulated. And we have certainly seen that many times over the last close to 15 years now that we've had RINs, many times where that market was manipulated in ways that ultimately were very dire for certain producers. So it's a challenge, right? Because on the one hand, you want to make sure that you're as optimal as possible in terms of that incentive, but sometimes the most optimal incentive is not going to do the job that you need it to either. And so it's
Yeah.
really from a policy design standpoint, it's been a major challenge for the sector.
That makes sense. So thinking about then, like, investment into the sector, like, how do investors deal with all of these uncertainties, whether it's around policy and market manipulation, like the models that we were talking about in standardization, and, like, how are you kind of hearing that conversation come through as you're talking to folks?
They're going to go
Right.
where the profit margins are at the end of
Okay.
the day. And
Yep.
regardless of what those profit margins, whether that's just the underlying economics or if that's, the policy design, they will go there. This is why we are seeing New York companies sending everything up to Canada. This
Mm.
is why we're seeing, what is it? I believe 80% of the diesel fuel consumed in California now is renewable diesel. That's where the incentive is. So
Yeah.
the incentive is going to drive that. And that's why it's such a challenge to, on the one hand, you don't want to waste dollars. But on the other hand, if the incentive is not sufficient, you're not going to hit your targets. And not to pick on New York, but we've had a climate law in place for 7 years now that has some very, very ambitious targets, but there's never been any incentive set up to pursue those targets. And those targets have failed miserably. We've
Yeah.
basically
Right.
made no progress in 7 years because of that. Meanwhile, places like California that have similarly ambitious targets, they've put together programs like their LCFS in support of that, and they're making major, major reductions to their greenhouse gas emissions
Yeah.
because of it.
Yeah, no, it's very true. So I want to kind of, like, and it's something you and I were talking about just before we kicked on, and we hadn't prepped for this, but I think it's a really interesting piece because I've been kind of obsessed, again, coming from a fossil fuel background. I've been obsessed with what's going on right now with oil prices and Strait of Hormuz being shut, like, how real demand destruction might be on the fossil fuel side. And you kind of led with it at the top, where the substitution space for fuels isn't just a matter of, like, what we put in our cars and the gas that comes into our homes. It's plastics, it's everything.
Mhm.
Like, as you're looking at, again, this market impacts of high oil prices and stuff like that, like, how permanent do you think potential substitutions right now might be? Like, versus just, like, temporary solutions because prices are high. Like, I'm really curious kind of of your thoughts of, like, how the current market is gonna impact adoption of, the bioeconomy, essentially.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the impacts are going to be very long term. And the reason I
Mhm.
say that, so I've been teaching a sustainable energy policy class since 2012. And
Oh, wow.
every semester since 2012, we've spent a week talking about the Strait of Hormuz. Right. And, the students would always say, why are we talking about this? Right. We never hear about this in the news, anything like that. But there was always a figure I would show, which is in 2011, a random admiral that nobody had ever heard of in Iran had come out. He was given a press conference. He was getting lots of questions. And at one point, he said, by the way, just noting, if we wanted to shut down the strait, all I have to do is pick up the phone and the strait will be shut down. And petroleum markets, right, the price of crude, Brent crude, spiked. right? And I actually show the
Yeah.
trading figure, in class where just this one random person saying this caused that price spike. Well, now we've seen what actually happens, right? We've seen why no U.S. president in the past has ever wanted to tackle Iran in a way that could cause the strait to be shut down. It's because now we're talking about possibly seeing $200 per barrel Brent by May, which is,
Yeah.
even in 2008, July of 2008, we didn't come close to that. So
No.
this is going to have major, major ramifications long term, and especially if the current Iranian regime stays in power. Well, we're never going to look at the Persian Gulf the same way again
Yeah.
in terms of a supply chain, right? Because now that's always going to be a risk that's faced. So I think, especially in countries that have climate targets, but even those that don't, the joke in 2025 was, the worst thing to happen to climate policy was the Trump administration. I'm now hearing, similar jokes saying the best thing to
Okay.
happen in 2026 is the Trump administration, right? Because now we're back to looking at alternatives. We're looking at alternatives, especially alternatives that are going to be produced domestically. And domestically produced alternatives tend to be, for most of the world, renewable. Now, in the
Yeah.
US, we have lots of domestic crude and natural gas, so maybe not as big of a situation here, but especially places like Europe, where renewable energy was really struggling to compete with fossil fuels, that dynamic has changed drastically. And so I think we're
No.
going to see a lot more investment because, again, that's where the incentives are going to be. In this case, it's a market incentive rather than a policy incentive,
Yeah.
but the outcome's the same.
The piece that you talk about, and I've heard this, and it sort of drives me crazy with the conversation that's coming out of the administration and stuff like that around, well, we produce a lot of oil and gas here in the US, so we're fine. And it actually takes away the piece around refining. And like, it'll be
Hmm.
interesting to see, we ship our light crudes to the Middle East because their refineries are good for that. Our refineries that were built in the 50s were built for heavy crude that comes
Very high
into the Middle
complexity.
East.
Yep.
And, like, the substitution, though, around biofuels going through the same US refineries, actually, like, it could in terms of fuels for folks as, one of the obvious examples where there's replacement, I don't know, I don't even though, again, this whole rhetoric around, like, the US is the biggest producer in the world, which is not untrue, but we're not the biggest refiner in the world, and that's the piece that is often missed in this conversation, so I think it'll be to your point around locally produced, I believe, but correct me if I'm wrong, that we actually have more local capacity for supply chains on the biofuel side than we actually do on the
Hmm.
crude side. And so I think that nuance of the conversation that's been completely missed in any,
Yes.
again, Biden administration completely. But even, I do listen to a lot of like political podcasts and other things, and it's overlooked completely. And it'll be interesting to see how the administration kind of deals with that rhetoric when prices still go up at the pump and for other kind of things. Anyway, I'm curious as to your thoughts on that. But like, we've seen US refiners switch to biofuels quite easily. And to your point, like those supply chains are local. Like it's
Hmm.
farmers here in the US providing some of that biofuel and stuff like that. The feedstocks are less susceptible to. Um, the Strait of Hormuz being shut, not completely avoid of it, but definitely I believe less susceptible. So yeah, I don't know. I'm curious as to your thoughts around that, but it blows my mind that that piece is being missed in this conversation
Well, it
completely.
absolutely has, and we're already seeing the market effects. So if you look, I was just reading this morning, if you look at the share prices of the major airlines in the U.S., right? So American, Delta, United, American and United, I believe their share prices are down by about 20%
Wow.
since the crisis began. Delta has barely moved. Difference between Delta and the other two, Delta has its own refinery that it uses in
Oh,
Pennsylvania. So it is producing its own aviation
yeah.
fuel.
Yeah.
The other two don't. And so they have to purchase whatever the prices are on the market. And to your point, right, we don't have that type of refining capacity in the US. We're probably not building any new refineries anytime soon either. So diesel fuel and aviation fuel in particular, yeah, we may have plenty of petroleum. And if you've got a, low complexity refinery in Texas, you're going to be doing great. But for everyone else, this is why diesel fuel is at $5 a gallon right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have all the crude. You're not putting crude in a semi trailer. You got to
No.
convert it to diesel. We don't have the capacity to do that in the US. And so, yeah, we're in this strange, right? It's kind of like, dying of thirst in the desert, and there's an
Yeah.
ocean nearby, right? We've got all
It's
the
a really
crude,
good analogy. Yeah, because
but
you're
we don't
not
have the
gonna.
fuel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's gonna be fascinating to see how this plays out. I think it's anyway, I'm glad we kind of dipped into it. It's been something that I've been like mildly obsessed with for the last few weeks as we've sort of just seen, particularly some of the rhetoric coming out around like how this is going to get solved. And
Mhm.
I'm like, that's not how this works.
Exactly. Yep.
Anyway, so I'm curious, what's on your radar, like right now, and like what are you looking, working on, and excited about in the next sort of 6 to 12 months. I don't know, even like with everything going on in the markets in the next month and stuff like that.
Well, it's,
So,
as some of my colleagues say, this is job security, right? Boring is bad for our job security. When
yeah,
everybody is confused and trying to figure out what's going on and the market's constantly shifting, that's really good news for us. And so it's an interesting time to be working in this space. And so, a couple of things really looking closely at. One is to your point, right, as we start thinking substitution effects. This was so I started my career in 2008, late 2008, early 2009, and it was a fantastic time to be in the space, right? Because everyone was focused on how do we find alternatives to these really, really scarce fossil fuels. This is kind of something similar, right? It's a
yeah,
very, very similar situation in a lot of ways. And so I'm really interested to see what happens with that. You've got the non fuel products. Are we finally going to start seeing lots of policy support, especially in places like Europe, for non fuel sustainable products, right?
yeah.
Or in terms of trying to move off of, your fossil fuel fertilizer and other things, fossil fuel plastics. We also have at the last COP30 in Brazil, there's what's called the Belém 4x sustainable fuels target.
Cool.
And this was a pretty major outcome where the world essentially, I won't say the entire world, but it was an outcome of COP30. You had enough participants saying, okay, we have a commitment now to scale up sustainable fuel production worldwide by 4x.
Oh wow.
Now, that was in November. Now, suddenly that takes on a whole new meaning, right? It's being viewed in a whole new light because that's an alternative to your Persian Gulf crude.
Yeah.
So really, this was something that we were working on a lot because a big question worldwide is, okay, can we actually ensure that that sustainable fuel target is being met by sustainable fuels, right? We don't view sustainable fuel as just a word, all right, or a
Yeah.
phrase where we're really focused on making sure that these fuels are truly sustainable. So there was a lot of work going on in terms of, okay, how does that fit into land use change? How do we make sure that rainforests are not being wiped out, so that we can pursue these sustainable fuels? Now that we see market incentives for these fuels, now that we see a lot of interest in producing fuels that are not going to be exposed, as you point out, to Persian Gulf nearly as directly, this makes us even more critical. And so, going to be doing a lot of analysis, a lot of, for molecule group consensus building around best practices to ensure that the fuels contributing to this 4x target are actually sustainable.
I love that. And we haven't even touched on land use change in the biospace and stuff. But again, to your point, like that's such a big piece of this in terms of what that looks like and what that means
So
in
much,
the
yeah.
bioeconomy, the agriculture space, and all this kind of stuff as well. So to wrap up and close, you and I are both going to be down in Fort Worth in the next few weeks.
Yes.
You're going to be joining me on a panel called Fueling Controversy: Are Biofuels Helping or Hurting? And I'm very much looking forward to it. Yeah, any thoughts on the TEI event as we wrap up? So,
So I've attended a couple of these events in the past, and they are brilliant. Just in the sense, right? As an academic, I go to a lot of conferences where it's thousands of people, and you don't really get anything done. You don't have conversations, right? The sessions don't really; they're not informative. The TEI events that I've been to, it's very focused, right? And so everyone in the room is an expert. And
love
so
that.
it's not just the panels, right? It's the people that you're going to talk to at the event. Really, really informative, really, really educational. The panels are great, in part because of the questions you get from the audience.
Oh, cool.
And so it's going to be I'm really looking forward to it. Obviously, the way that this panel is being set up, it's to a certain extent kind of binary. So we're going to have some great discussions. This is not going to be a boring topic, but yeah, the entire event, I'm really looking forward to being back.
No, I'm really privileged to be included in the event, and I would echo your comment about smaller events with the right people in the room. It's my favorite place to play
Yes,
in that space. So,
absolutely. You cannot
um,
beat them, in my opinion.
yeah, it's awesome. So no, everyone should look out for that and some of the stuff coming out for it. And if you haven't registered and you're interested in the fuels space generally, everyone should meet us in Fort Worth. So Tristan,
By all
thank you.
means.
Yeah, Tristan, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for
Likewise.
joining me today.
Really
So
fun. Thank you for
um,
having me.
thanks so much.